I think one of the things that you'll notice today as we're talking about trauma, and particularly about post-traumatic stress disorder, is that in many ways responses to trauma make sense, although they don't necessarily make sense to the person who experiences the trauma or to their friends and family. So I'm going to start with a story. And this is a story of Marcy, who was outside playing in her family's yard with her younger sisters. Her brother was nearby, and while she was there, a neighbor's dog came into the yard and began to attack her, and she was pretty seriously hurt. The neighbor, the owner of the dog, ran to get help. Her older brother actually lunged at the dog at one point in order to scare the dog off. The dog stayed there growling and really being very terrifying to almost anyone. Marcy, the little girl who was obviously very frightened. She experienced a lot of damage. She was really hurt pretty badly, strapped down to a papoose board and taken to the hospital, where she had a number of interventions both then and later. Now, not surprisingly, she experienced a fair number of symptoms, and those symptoms are consistent with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm just going to give you the brief version of the disorder here. You can look at a longer version in your book, which I believe is page 113. A number of things are characteristic of the disorder: exposure to trauma, intrusion symptoms, which could be intrusive thoughts, it could be nightmares, it could be flashbacks, attempts to avoid those intrusive symptoms and avoid anything related to that, alterations in thoughts and mood, and negative, alterations in arousal and reactivity, and this has to occur for more than 1 month. Clinically significant distress and not attributable to a substance. Let me make a comment about the 1 month duration. It doesn't mean that Marcy's responses right after the attack were not post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, they weren't, but they were called acute stress disorder. And many people experience symptoms right after a trauma, and that sometimes they resolve within that, within the next period. So if we're talking about Jeff, Marcy, Kathy, and Susan, these are the DSM-3R criteria. And you see that Marcy clearly had the most symptoms. She had symptoms on all but one of the symptoms. Jeff, although he was not attacked himself, experienced a number of symptoms, and I would encourage you to think about why. Kathy and Susan did not meet DSM-3R criteria. They did not meet criteria, but they also had a fair number of symptoms, and you might wonder why. So as you're looking at the diagnosis, you'll see, first of all, that it's experiencing of, life-threatening stimulus or trauma, or also observing that. You can imagine how Jeff, while he was watching this trauma, his sister being attacked, and here he is, the older brother, and older brothers are often, very protective of their younger siblings. And you can imagine that he was there wanting to protect his younger sister. We'll come back to talking about Jeff and Marcy later. So think about post-traumatic stress disorder and what it's like for a child. Adults may talk about their symptoms. They may experience flashbacks and nightmares. They may experience intrusive thoughts, some of which we may not be able to see, particularly with a child as young as Susan. With children, the memories may not appear distressing, but they may experience a lot of repetitive play, and that may show up in their drawings. They may show up in the kinds of games that they're playing. Their nightmares, if I were exposed to a trauma, my nightmares probably would share the same kind of content as the trauma. A young child's nightmare may not. It may look more like, monsters or something like that. We talked in Chapter 3 about comorbid disorders, and there are a lot of disorders that are comorbid with PTSD, most significantly major depressive disorder, where about 70% of people diagnosed with PTSD are also diagnosed with major depressive disorder. We saw with Marcy that there was both a life threat and injury. And you can see that people with a current diagnosis of PTSD or a lifetime diagnosis with PTSD were much more likely to experience, to have both life threat and injury. There's something very threatening about that. So what puts people at risk? Clearly, one piece seems to be stress prior to a trauma, or, some sort of history of early problems or experiences with uncontrollable events. Think about that in terms of that story that someone might tell about their life. Oh, my cat really wants me to play with her. It might be that early in life, one has learned that there's nothing I can do. There's some suggestion about early trauma. Clearly, if we're looking at concordance rates for identical and fraternal twins, there are somewhat higher concordance rates for identical twins. If you're comparing those concordance rates with those that we saw with schizophrenia, not quite as impressive. Some suggestion about intelligence. Lower intelligence puts people at risk, perhaps because they're not able to perceive what kinds of things or how they might handle things better. They're unable to see their behavior as appropriate, and poor social support. And social support is a huge issue. So let's talk a little bit about treatment. We're going to talk, you'll probably see this figure a number of times through the semester. You're seeing in the figure this relationship between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, that our thoughts create the feelings create the behaviors, and the behaviors reinforce the thoughts. So as we're trying to make changes, we're going to be intervening with the thoughts. We may have people identify and examine the evidence for their conclusions, test those conclusions, and decatastrophize. Is it really as bad as they believe it is? Think about the maladaptive schemas that people have with post-traumatic stress disorder, where they are exaggerating the risk associated or that they're experiencing. and overgeneralizing, their emotional response to maybe inappropriate people and situations. A friend of mine was working with a woman who had a history of child abuse, and she, first of all, was very reactive when she saw someone wearing a white shirt. And you can imagine how that could cause problems in a variety of realms. But she's exaggerating the risk associated with that and applying it to situations that don't really make sense. In my friend's case, he was unable to wear a white shirt, at least initially, for the first while that he was working with her as her therapist. Typical automatic thoughts might include, I can't keep myself safe, and if I feel scared, I must be in danger, kind of emotional reasoning. In the course of treatment, we're going to do some psychoeducation about ways that trauma has led to the re-experiencing arousal and avoidance kinds of behaviors, and what this means, and sort of normalizing that process. And we may help people develop some, so often people who are anxious begin to breathe shallowly and rapidly, and we may help them correct their breathing patterns, so fuller, more even, during places when they're near the trigger. So for example, my friend's client learned to challenge her thinking about being around a white shirt, to be able to recognize that it was an inappropriate kind of response, and to correct her breathing, to slow it down under those circumstances. So systematic desensitization is one kind of treatment that's sometimes used with post-traumatic stress disorder, including teaching someone how to learn, or teaching someone relaxation skills, creating a fear hierarchy. And you can see here between, on the top left, the picture of the spider, and on the bottom right, holding the spider. So creating a fear hierarchy, and then practicing relaxation skills in combination with scenes from the hierarchy. And we can either do that in reality or by imagining it. So here is Marcy's hierarchy, with the things that were least scary at the bottom of the hierarchy and the things most scary at the top. Imagine a child with the kinds of medical issues that Marcy had following the attack by the dog. Then the difficulties, in terms of responding to that situation. She needed to be able to go to the hospital without being afraid. And yet that was something very difficult. What her therapists did is start at the bottom of the hierarchy, taught her how to relax, and then began to associate relaxation with each of these stimuli. And you can see in the fear ratings after the systematic desensitization that her fear went way down. So what should you do now? Consider the ways that you cope with stressors. Given our discussions of avoidance, are there places that you'd like to reconsider your strategies? And second, we've talked about breathing and muscle control strategies. Consider practicing these. So breathe slowly in and then out, counting to 3. And if I were you, I would practice this throughout the day, 20 times a day, even if you're not having problems. And then it will become automatic if you need some help in handling stress better. And this is it for Chapter 5. Take care.